Hello class, welcome back. Today's lecture is going to be a little different. Rather than work through the content in the textbook, we're going to take a time out and look at some case studies, some examples from my professional history. You'll recall that I was the director of CREST, the Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force. I joined them as a biologist before I became the director, so I got to see some of these restoration projects excuse me, on the ground from a biologist perspective. And then as I moved my way up the ladder, I got to work more closely on the planning of the construction projects themselves and the negotiation for permits and funding, etc. So I got to see all different levels of involvement in these restoration projects, and I'm happy to walk you through some of those experiences. So at CREST, I oversaw a few programs, the most important of which was the restoration program, at least important in terms of manpower and funding. We also had an ecosystem monitoring program doing the before and after research on these projects. Our bread and butter, though, and the reason CREST exists in the first place, is to assist local communities and ports and counties with environmental planning. And so we had planners on staff as well who interacted more with the communities of the Lower Columbia than individual landowners. And of course we had financial administrators and a board overseeing our activities as well. Let's talk specifically about the habitat restoration we did there, though. And we'll hear more from CREST, the current version of CREST, as the course goes along. But some of the things that program was responsible for delivering were the following: identify, prioritize, and develop restoration projects. So go out and find projects, usually on behalf of one of the major regional funding agencies who was required legally to do that work. Next, this program was responsible for scoping the projects, and you'll hear me use that term a lot. It's basically when you select a project, you begin to develop the technical resources to evaluate its project potential and begin building some designs. This scoping would take you through the various feasibility analyses and the various funding reviews that you needed to get through in order to proceed. Next, we would actually design and implement projects on the ground, typically 3 to 5 per year, which is no small feat, especially when you think about these projects taking anywhere between 2 and 10 years to plan. That means that there's a lot of projects in various phases of development at any given time. And one of the challenges at this organization and many organizations like it is just keeping all of those fires going and being super well organized and having very effective communication so that none of these projects met with undue delays. And finally, we performed action effectiveness monitoring on these projects whenever the funding was available. And that's important to tell the story of the success of the project and hopefully attract more interest and more resources towards future projects. So let's talk about some examples. All of these case studies, I want you to think about them in terms of the following. What's the problem? Who are the stakeholders? What was the identified solution to the problem? Were there any specific challenges associated with each project? And were there any unusual things that the project manager had to do and be responsible for? So as you're taking notes, I would suggest that you look at each project and try to identify those 5 things. At a minimum, you should definitely be able to do problem, stakeholders, solution. Meaning, what's the ecological problem? What answer did we come up with? And who was this project serving? Who were we doing this project for? Now, if you have some additional tidbits you'd like to throw in there with respect to each individual project, then wonderful. All right, so I'm going to start with a project called Fort Columbia. This was essentially a fish passage issue. So Highway 101 runs along the coast, and in the vicinity of Chinook, Washington, it cuts off a bunch of floodplain wetlands. The wetlands behind the highway were actually really quite nice. Tidal swamp, forested wetland. And while it was providing habitat to things like birds, it was no longer providing habitat to outmigrating juvenile salmon. So historically, before this highway was built, salmon that were headed downstream as juveniles, little guys, would have pulled off into these estuarine tidal wetlands to transition to the ocean, meaning they needed to give their bodies time to transition to saltwater. They needed to fatten up as much as they could, and they needed to take shelter from the many, many predators hunting them. So these wetlands were essential to healthy salmon stocks returning a few years later. Unfortunately, as is the case all over the estuary, and as is the case all over the world, a lot of these environments were either drained, diked, leveed, manipulated, you name it. In this case, it's simply a highway that imposed a barrier on access to not only fish, but to the tide itself. So the tide was no longer coming in and out of this wetland twice a day. So not only is it a problem for fish, but normally this wetland would be exporting seeds and insects and all kind of nutrients into the estuary. And the estuary has become more impoverished with all of these peripheral wetlands cut off over the years. Usually cut off either because of transportation in this case, or to drain and build farmland, as you'll see in some other examples. So the problem here, in this case, is access to off-channel wetlands for juvenile salmon. And there, of course, are other more minor problems as well, like flooding to the local community. This wetland had a tendency to back up and flood some houses under heavy rains. So the solution that we came up with at the time was to install this huge 12 by 12 box culvert. And doesn't seem like a big deal, except it's a major highway. So we had major transportation concerns and keeping people going, at least in one lane, while this bridge was built, because it's in a major economic thoroughfare. And the other issues were more technical, having to do with installing this in soft sediments and installing it in such a way that it would have the capacity to move the tide in and out, etc. Now, while we were in there, we also improved the habitat a little bit. So we installed some large woody debris, which is good habitat for juvenile salmon, and we did a little bit of revegetation. But primarily, the solution here was installation of this culvert. And there is the outcome. So you can see there's a nice channel draining and providing access to the wetlands. This is at low tide. At a high tide, all of that would be flush with water, and there would be lots of juvenile salmon, Chinook, coho, chum, etc., using the off-channel habitat, especially during their migration period. Now, I mentioned that working on a major roadway is challenging. It does have a lot of logistical and technical concerns. There were other things, of course, that were unique to this project, one being the power lines right there. Two, making sure that we were going to make the flooding problem less of a problem and doing some modeling to demonstrate that to the community. And three, attracting funding. So this was one of the early projects in the estuary. It was quite expensive, and we really had to work to convince the funding agencies that it met their cost-benefit concerns, that the outcome here ecologically was worth it, because the price tag was pretty steep. Now, they've since gone on to authorize much, much bigger, more ambitious projects, but this was one of the first. All right, let's have a look at another case study. This is Otter Point. Let me see what other slides I got here. Otter Point is part of a national park. I should mention that Fort Columbia earlier was a state park, so that was our stakeholder. And this, well, not to mention the public, but in this case we have a national park, and they inherited some land that had been diked. That's what this is right here, or that's what this was a barrier to the tide. Again, the tide is a very powerful force. It can rise 7 or 8 feet during a high tide in this part of the world, and it excavates impressive channels. It moves material in and out of these wetlands twice a day with considerable force. And so local farmers were interested in stopping that tide from entering their land and draining the land with things like tide gates and ditches, such that they could dry it out just enough to attempt to grow some crops, but more likely to graze animals. In any case, we worked with the national park, Lewis and Clark National Historic Park, to remove this barrier and reestablish the tidal channels that were there historically, basically turning this into good juvenile salmon habitat again, but trying not to do so at the expense of the neighbors who were concerned about flood control, and trying not to do so at the expense of the other park inhabitants, including elk and things like that. So it was an interesting project. What we ended up doing as a solution was breaching the levee in several places, allowing the tide back in, but not until we had already preconditioned the site by excavating these tidal channels here and here. Before we breached, we also installed tons and tons of native plants and lots of woody debris. Basically giving that habitat a giant shot in the arm prior to reconnecting it, so that it would be good habitat from day one. You know, if you leave these projects alone, they will eventually revegetate on their own. They will eventually become good habitat on their own. But in this case, we did a lot of work to make sure it was ready to go. The other thing we did was removed invasive plants, and we built a cross dike, this thing right here. So the dike used to go this direction, and we turned the corner and built a new one right here as to protect these farms. So the farms are actually getting better and more reliable protection out of this. So that's an example of a neat compromise where the park got what it wanted, we got what we wanted and our goals for the local ecosystem, and the neighbors got what they wanted in terms of protecting their investments. So that's the kind of thing you have to do with every ecosystem restoration project, is find some common ground, make sure everyone is involved and everyone is communicated with. This project was especially problematic, though, in the permitting phase. This project came along after Hurricane Katrina, when the Army Corps was intensifying its permitting process to make sure that they reduced their liability in any kind of situation where a dike or levee could breach. So the dike that I spoke about before, the historic one, was originally constructed by the Army Corps in the 30s. And then it was handed over to a local diking district, basically a group of farmers who would be responsible for its maintenance into the future. Well, a lot of those diking districts went belly up, didn't have the resources to do the maintenance anyway. Nevertheless, the Corps still is legally on the hook for the performance of those structures, even though they spent no money on maintenance. That's a long story. But they wanted to make sure if we built something new, as in that cross dike, that we built it to their new post-Katrina standards. And we had to pass through something they called the Section 408 permitting process. Nobody had done it before, nationwide. And so it was a real challenge for our engineers to work with the Corps. And frankly, the dike we built was overkill. It was way, way above and beyond the flood control necessary for that site. But now everyone, including the Corps, has the utmost confidence that that project will not backfire on us. And in fact, it's probably well prepared to deal with things like climate change and sea level rise. All right, a couple more examples. Nat Creek. So this was kind of a fun one where, again, we had crumbling dikes and levees. We had abandoned land that was only marginally wet and marginally offering good wetland habitat. There's quite a lot of levee in various states of decay. And what we did was we removed a lot of that levee, and then we improved the habitat complexity with large woody debris. Oh, and we also took out a small earthen dam. Well, that wasn't all there was to it. We actually came back for a second phase of dike breaching, and in the end, we restored on Nat Creek, which is another tributary of the Lower Columbia, we restored about 70 acres. The reason I wanted to show this project to you was its inaccessibility. So you couldn't just drive a backhoe and a dump truck out to this site. There was no access. It was too wet already. So what we had to do was get creative and start contracting with barge operators to float the equipment in. So again, the problem on this project and the solution on this project were pretty similar to what we just discussed with Otter Point. But some of the specifics around the project design and the project implementation were very, very unique. And you know, we cut our teeth on this one and went on to do a number of other projects with barges as well. Okay, Dibley Point. This one is a little different. We did remove a fish passage barrier. We did excavate new wetlands and restore connection and improve habitat with some similar goals. But we had some unique constraints. So there's a roadway across this site that connects to a major sand dredging operation. So an industrial business. And we needed to make sure that the bridges and culverts we installed could handle that truck traffic. And that we did not disrupt their business enterprise in any way. So that's why you see some huge culverts, some big road fills, and some substantial equipment. Not that it was a huge project, but that the stakeholder had some very specific anxieties, and we had to work around those. All right, I think I'm going to save these other examples for later in the course. I know that Crest guest lecturers are going to want to talk about some of these, so I'm not going to steal their thunder. I'm just going to give you a few shots of some of the types of habitats we were working on restoring in the Lower Columbia River. So for example, this is Sauvie Island near Portland, Oregon, and it was a sea of weeds, and now it's got beautiful channels and lakes available to migrating fish and other wildlife. This is Carlson Island, part of a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service property. And again, people in the old days tried to dike and levee and farm this rather unsuccessfully. And we were in the business of just removing those structures. But again, it was tricky to get to, and we had to use some very specialized techniques. I think that what I want to show you here is in reference to the first case study, so Fort Columbia. This is just to show that before restoration, there was no fish access. Maybe we would catch a few fish, a few juveniles kind of hanging around the outlet because there was a very small culvert. Usually we'd catch a few Chinook hanging around. But inside the culvert, as soon as that project was constructed, there were multiple species of fish using that wetland, like immediately. So the wildlife, has a very keen sense for where the food and shelter is and where the quality habitat is. And if you just provide openings, if you just reconnect them with the tide, in this case, they will get there, and they'll get there in a hurry. And that is really inspiring, and that is the bottom line, is we're trying to improve the natural environment, and we're also trying to improve human systems at the same time. We're trying to make sure that the human communities get something out of this as well. And we see progress as soon as the project is implemented. All right, that's it for now. I hope that paints a nice picture of not just my background, but the type of work that project managers in the Lower Columbia do. And as the course moves along, you'll definitely get more familiar with the required skills associated with doing that kind of work. And those skills, although they certainly apply to this work, are also quite transferable. So you'll be able to take those in any direction you like. So I look forward to talking more soon. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see you next time.